What is up, YouTube? My name is Trinity, and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. So it's certainly been a minute. After Spooktober, I decided to take a bit of a break just because plans that I had had for Spooktober just did not pan out, and I got really discouraged for a while. However, I'm back, I feel refreshed. I've tried to simplify what I'm doing as well as make it more on theme for the spookiness that I'm doing, so hopefully that can also help me feel more confident in what I am doing. Today we are going to be talking about a true crime case that I have been dying to get to. I've recorded this video a few times, but I was never happy with the results, so I think this is the one. Today we're going to be talking about the disappearance of the Sodder children. Christmas Eve, 1945, a small family home outside of Fayetteville, West Virginia caught fire. The home was owned by George and Jenny Sodder, and at the time of the fire, 9 of their 10 children were home. The parents escaped the blaze with only 4 of their children, leaving 5 of their children, 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 10-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny Irene, and 5-year-old Betty inside. When the firefighters eventually arrived, the family expected them to pull the remains of their children from the fire. However, no bodies were ever recovered, leading the family to believe that those children had been taken from the house before the fire had even started. Let's go back, however, because there are a lot of details that likely played a part in what happened to these children. George Sodder was only 13 years old when he immigrated from Italy to the United States with an older brother. Throughout his life, he never really opened up about what drove him to leave Italy or come here to the United States. He first started working on railroads in Pennsylvania, though later on became a truck driver in West Virginia, where he eventually started his own company. This is also where he met his wife Jenny, who also happened to be an Italian immigrant. They were married in 1922 and settled just outside of Fayetteville, West Virginia, which had a large Italian immigrant community. This is where they started their lives and their very large family, and became a very well-respected middle-class family. Despite this, George was a very outspoken man, and his loud opinions rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Namely, he was very outspoken of his criticisms for Benito Mussolini and the fascist dictatorship of Italy. Even after the end of World War II and the death of Mussolini, many people still remembered his sentiments about him and were still pretty upset by them. In October of 1945, just 2 months before the fire happened, an insurance salesman visited the Sodder household. He warned George that his house was going to go up in smoke and that his children were going to be destroyed for his dirty remarks about Benito Mussolini. Later in the year, another man visited the house looking for work, and he warned George that the fuse boxes in the back of the house were going to cause a fire one day, despite the fact that George had rewired the entire house recently and the electric company themselves had deemed it safe. It was also around this time that George's older sons began to notice the same car every day going into the highway into town, watching the younger Sodder children on their way home from school. On the night of the fire, which again was Christmas Eve, Jenny allowed the children to stay up past their normal bedtimes, reminding Maurice and Louis around 10 p.m. to go tend the animals before they went to sleep. After that, she, George, and her 2 oldest sons all went to bed. A little after midnight, Jenny received a phone call from an unknown woman, who asked her for a name that she didn't recognize. When Jenny told her this, she said that the woman let out a really weird, unsettling laugh, and then hung up. As she was going back to bed, she noticed that the curtains of the house were still open, something that the children usually took care of before they went to bed, but she figured it was Christmas, they were probably excited, and they were also staying up late, so they probably went to bed and just forgot about it. She closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and then went back to bed. At around 1 a.m., Jenny was awoken by the sound of a bang, and then a rolling sound. Though after no other sounds followed, she decided it was probably nothing and went back to bed again. That is until 30 minutes later when she woke up again, this time to the smell of smoke. She discovered a fire in George's office and immediately got to work getting him up. After that, they woke the 2 oldest sons and their daughter Marion and grabbed their youngest Sylvia, and together escaped the house because the stairs to where the other children were sleeping was already on fire, so as they called up, they couldn't really hear anything, So George had planned to go outside and somehow get up to that window and save his other children. At first, George attempted to climb the side of the house and even broke a window, cutting his arm open, but he could not get in. He couldn't find the ladder that was normally just leaning against the side of the house in its normal spot, or really anywhere in the area, which was very strange. And unfortunately, the barrels of water that had been sitting outside in case something like this happened were frozen solid because it was so cold. He then took his sons to try to pull his work trucks around to use them to climb up to the second floor to get to the children. But neither of them would start despite working just fine the previous day. Their oldest daughter, Marion, ran to the nearest neighbor's house, which wasn't very close at all, to try to call the fire department. At the same time, a driver on the main road also saw the fire and stopped at the nearest location that had a phone and tried to get a hold of the fire department as well to call for help. But he couldn't even get a hold of the operator. Eventually, someone did reach the fire department. I'm not sure which or if even more calls had come in that night, but they didn't arrive until later in the morning, meaning that the family had to watch their house burn to the ground as they believed the rest of their children were inside, just burning to death, which is probably one of the most brutal ways to go. Because it took the firefighters a while to get there, when they eventually arrived, there wasn't much for them to do besides sift through the ash that was left. But by 10 a.m. that morning, they still had not found any bodies. Now, there are some accounts that allege that some bone fragments were found at this time, but there's a lot of conflicting information around the story, and my personal belief is nothing was found just because of events we're going to talk to in a little bit. Fire Chief Morris, who is going to become a very frustrating person to talk about in this telling, believed that the fire had been hot enough and burned long enough to completely destroy the bodies, which we're going to talk about that more later, but it's very unlikely. Also, the local coroner deemed that the fire had been started by faulty wiring, which, again, George had just rewired the house and had the electric company check it, and they said it was fine. Death certificates were issued on December 30th, and the funerals for all of them were held on January 2nd, but George and Jenny were just too heartbroken and sick to even attend, but the rest of the children did. I'm going to tell you a couple of questions that the family pointed out at the time, or that people have pointed out over time when reading this case, and also some details that were found out after the events of the fire. So one, the ladder that George had been looking for, that's normal place was sitting at the side of the house, was found 75 feet away at the bottom of an embankment. Again, if the normal place for this ladder, something that typically isn't used every single day, is right next to the house, who moved it? Second, the family pointed out that the Christmas lights had still been on during the fire, meaning if it was an electrical fire, wouldn't they have gone out as the fire had started? Wouldn't the power to the house have been cut? It was also found out later that the telephone line had not been burned, but it had been intentionally cut by a third party who apparently had nothing to do with the actual fire. This person was a man who was identified for theft and later admitted to it, but also it means that this guy had to climb up 14 feet into the air and lean 2 feet out into open air in order to cut this thing. The guy said he thought it was the power line, but then he also wasn't involved with the fire, so I don't know what that's about. But it's really weird that these two things happened on the same night, allegedly. And the phone line was conveniently the one cut. Also, Jenny talked to workers at a crematorium that told her there is no way this fire burned long enough or hot enough to completely destroy the remains of her children. Mind you, the house wasn't completely ash when the firefighters found it. It was a lot of ash, but appliances and bits of the roof were still intact. Jenny even did her own little experiments with burning bones and seeing how long they had to burn before they fell apart and at what temperatures. During the spring, the Sodders just decided to bulldoze the entire lot where their house had been once and plant a garden over it, just in memory of their children. And Jenny would tend and care for this memorial until the day she died. Though later on, when more and more questions began to come up as to what really happened to the children, this also took on a new meaning of, as she tended the garden, it kept her hope alive a bit that her kids were out there somewhere, that this garden was somehow connected to them. Now, some more weird details and evidence that something else happened that night. A bus driver who was driving by the house at night claimed to see people throwing balls of fire at the house. And after all of the snow melted in the spring, their youngest daughter, Sylvia, who was 3 years old at the time, found this huge hard rubber ball like thing. And that's when George recalled Jenny had woken up that night. And she had heard a big bang and then rolling from what could have been the roof or the other room. And he said that the thing looked a lot like a pineapple bomb or some other sort of incendiary device. This also supported the family's claim that the fire had started on the roof and burned downwards, rather than the fire chief's assertion that it had started on the bottom and burned upwards. Some witnesses even claimed that they saw the Sodder children themselves, such as a woman who was just watching the fire and saw a car go by and claimed to see the faces of the children through the window looking back at her. Another woman who was working at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed that she had served them breakfast on Christmas morning, and she noted a weird car in the parking lot that had Florida plates. The family also hired a private detective that determined that the salesman that had threatened George about his criticisms of Mussolini had been on the coroner's jury that initially deemed the fire an accident. He also heard rumors that he reported back to the Sodders that the fire chief had found a heart in the remains of the fire and for some reason had decided to keep it quiet from the family. And this turned out to be kind of true because Fire Chief Morris had confessed it to a minister that he had found the heart in the ashes and locked it away in a metal box. And this minister confirmed the rumor to George, who then went to confront the fire chief, and the fire chief confessed to everything and agreed to show them where the box was. The family then took the box to be analyzed, and it turned out it was not a human heart, it was beef liver. And beyond that, it had never been in a fire. So whatever the fire chief was trying to do was just complete bullshit. And when he was asked about why he would make this stuff up, he said that he hoped the Sodders would eventually find the box and assume it was complete evidence that their children were dead and just move on. In 1949, George came across a magazine that showed pictures of young ballerinas from school in New York City, and he said one looked incredibly similar to his daughter Betty. On that little spark of hope alone, George drove all the way to New York City and went to that girls' school and begged to see this girl for himself. And, of course, he was denied. Obviously, if a random man shows up at a school begging to see one specific little girl who does not know him, he is not related to her, obviously they have to take the safety of the child first, but I can't imagine how heartbreaking that must have been for George, because he wasn't like trying to be a creep or anything. He just really thought he had possibly found one of his kids. George also wrote to the FBI for assistance in what he believed was a kidnapping. The director of the FBI at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, said that they would love to help, but unless help was requested from either the police department or the fire department in this investigation, there was really nothing they could do because it wasn't their jurisdiction. Despite this at the time essentially being a cold case where no remains were ever found of these kids and a lot of bullshit had already happened with like local authorities, they declined to ask for assistance. In August of 1949, George convinced a pathologist from Washington, D.C. to oversee a new search of the remains of the house. This time, a more thorough search was eventually done, and there were remains found. There were some vertebrae, but it was extremely unlikely that they belonged to any of the children, mainly because there were no signs that this vertebrae had ever been exposed to fire. So that leaves the question of, was it already there and the house was just built on top of it? Or was it tossed in later by someone who may have been related to the fire? The most likely answer, though, is that this fragment was likely already in the dirt that George used to bulldoze the site. The case eventually caught the attention of the West Virginia legislator, who held a hearing on it in 1950. However, the governor and the state police superintendent told the family to their faces that the case was hopeless and essentially dead at a state level, which is why years earlier they really should have called in the FBI to help. But I can't imagine telling a family who not only lost one, but 5 children after losing their entire house. This case is hopeless. Like, even if you know the likelihood of it being solved is very minimal, you could at least say, like, you're still doing everything in your power, track down the kids if there is anything to find to see what happened. I don't think it's false hope to just say, even if it's unlikely, we're still doing everything we can for you and your family. The FBI then decided to get involved in the case as they saw it as a potential interstate kidnapping. However, they closed their investigation only 2 years in, as they said there was nothing really to find. The Sodders offered $5,000, though soon doubled this amount, to anyone who had any information that would solve the case of even one of their missing children. In 1952, in an effort to spread the word about this case and maybe get even more eyes on it, the Sodders decided to put up 2 different billboards, one at the initial site of the fire and one on US Route 60, sharing information about the case and pictures of their children. George and Jenny eventually met a woman named Ida Crutchfield, who claimed to have had an encounter with the children about a week after their initial disappearance. She ran a hotel in Charleston, West Virginia, and she claimed that the children had come in around 12 a.m. with 2 men and 2 women, all of Italian descent. When she tried to speak to one of the children, she said one of the men became very aggressive with her, and all of the adults began speaking in very rushed, agitated Italian to each other, and that the rest of the visit they refused to speak to each other and they left early the next morning. Despite this account potentially giving important information on who took the children if they had indeed been kidnapped, investigators, however, consider her story non-credible because she only saw pictures of the Sodder children 2 years after this initial incident, and then decided to come forward with her account 5 years after that, so a total of 7 years from when she initially saw the children. So even if she actually did see something, there's no way to confirm that they were definitely the same children. Just like the case of George visiting the school in New York City to see a girl who resembled his daughter Betty, he took a lot of investigation into his own hands to follow up on leads that authorities just wouldn't or deemed non-credible. He received a tip that his daughter Martha may be in a convent in Missouri. He also talked to the patron of a bar in Texas who claimed to have overheard people talking about a fire in West Virginia on Christmas Eve a few years back. He even investigated a relative of Jenny's in Florida whose children strongly resembled his, only believing that the children weren't his eventually when presented with proof that they were not. So you can see how one dedicated George was obviously to finding his kids, but also how it probably took a very hard mental toll on him. He probably also felt guilty to some degree because even though it is his right to voice his sentiments, and obviously speaking up against a fascist dictatorship is not the wrong thing to do, at the time it was frowned upon in his community. He probably felt like if I had just kept my mouth shut, my kids might be here with me. So that probably also didn't help with this obsession he seemed to have with following up on leads himself that never led anywhere. In 1967, he allegedly followed up on a tip about a man, again in Texas, who had confessed while very drunk that he was Louis Sodder, and he was there living with his brother Maurice. Now, police helped George track down the men from this alleged confession, but they vehemently denied ever saying anything like that and said they were absolutely not George's children. According to George's son-in-law, who I don't know if he was there at the time or not, he was apparently very disheartened and very haunted by this specific encounter because he didn't know for sure if he was looking at the faces of his sons or not. And that kind of stuck with him for the rest of his life. Later that year, the family received a letter that at least gave them hope that their son Louis may still be alive. The letter was addressed to Jenny with no return address, but it was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photo of a young man who strongly resembled Louis Sodder, and on the back there was some writing. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, LLIL boys, and the last line, which was A90132 or 35. After this, the family hired another PI to investigate Central City, Kentucky, but unfortunately, this guy kind of just disappeared with whatever they paid him, because when they tried to get in contact with him, he was never seen again, at least by then. They also added the picture that they received in the mail of allegedly Louis to both of the billboards, but they kept out any identifying information that was on the back, just in case publication of the information would put him in harm's way wherever he was. They also made an enlarged copy of this photo and hung it over their fireplace. George admitted to the Charleston Gazette that the lack of leads and info coming in was disheartening, and he felt like he was hitting a brick wall, but he was going to continue searching no matter what. In another interview, he said, quote, "Time is running out for us, but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." And he was absolutely right, because a year later, George Sodder passed away, and he never found out what happened to his children. Jenny and the rest of her children spent the rest of their lives seeking answers to what happened and trying to keep their story in the public eye, all save for their oldest son, John, who was the only child not at the house the night of the fire. He never talked about the fire that night, except to say that he wished his family would just accept what happened and move on with their life. Sounds harsh, especially because he was the only one not there, and he might just think his family was in denial because of the trauma they experienced that night. But we never really learned what the rest of the Sodder children went through during the rest of their childhoods. I can't imagine being like the remaining ones. There's probably a lot of survivor's guilt that goes into that, and maybe he just saw his family suffering so much that he wanted them to just put the whole thing to bed. Jenny stayed in the family house that they had built after the fire for the rest of her life, wearing black until she died in 1989. That's when the rest of her family, as well as, I assume, the new generation, decided it was time to take down the weathered billboards that they had put up so many decades ago. The surviving Sodder children and their children and grandchildren still work to keep the story in the public eye and are still looking for clues to this day. And with the advent of DNA testing and genealogy and all that, I feel like there's a good chance that this could be solved in the future. The leading theory is that the children were kidnapped by the Sicilian mafia and either shipped back to Italy to be ransomed to George, or were just killed in order to punish George for what he had done. It's also believed that if the children survived, they probably chose not to come forward to their family just to keep themselves or their family safe from whoever had taken them. George and Jenny's youngest daughter, Sylvia, died in 2020, and she said that her earliest memory was of the fire and that she carried a lot of sadness and grief with her, even though she was too young to really understand what was going on for a long time. And she remembered sitting up with her father, just puzzling and going over and over all the different possibilities of what could have happened to her siblings. So that was the unsolved case of the missing Sodder children. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a like and leave any comments down below as to what you think happened to them. There are so many different theories out there. I just wanted to tell you the main theory so we could maybe have a conversation in the comments down below. If you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you'll be notified anytime I upload. And be sure to check out my true crime playlist that I'll have linked at the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.